So here's a topic a little closer to what I normally focus on in my channel. For those of you who don't know, my main subject is the law of attraction and philosophy of mind. Recently, I've been talking about the Jehovah's Witnesses. Being an ex-member of this group, I have a lot to say about them. But my message is completely distinct from the largely negative, parochial, and frequently perverted slant one is wont to find on YouTube. The fact is, and perhaps you're learning this if you've engaged in conversations with those of other faiths, identitarian affiliation, especially religious identity, is far more profound and sophisticated than just a couple or a few fundamental assumptions. If you too are a former member of the Jehovah's Witnesses, just look back over your story. Think, did someone come along and show you how 1914 was a dubious arbitrary date the witnesses pulled out of their hat? Or how damaging excommunication was, and then suddenly you were enlightened? I highly doubt it. Rarely does it work like that. Most of us leave based on a preponderance of evidence which we would have otherwise turned a blind eye to if we were not ourselves victims of certain realities within the organization. Most of us struggled to narrow down precisely when we became open to the other side of the argument. Many of us likely went through a period of cognitive dissonance, where we become sensitive to certain issues, tried to rationalize it, but became overwhelmed, and eventually just had to abandon it. There are a number of fair and open-minded Jehovah's Witnesses who are in this exact predicament. A good deal of them are not prepared to leave because they have a social structure, and quite often, even a livelihood by their affiliation. Still others simply can't leave without losing quite literally everything. I mean, just think about it. Why is the suicide rate so high among the excommunicated? So recently, I've offered a rather unorthodox solution to those in this scenario. Stay. Remain to be a force for good and progress in this religion. Now that's an unusual message. I'm the first to admit it. And it begs a very obvious and troubling question you're likely dying to have me answer right now. And that is, what good can one possibly hope to effect in an 8 million member strong organization when the threat of excommunication is always looming over your head? Get real, Derek. It's a lost cause. But is it though? Is progress really a delusion? Let's talk about it. Hey good people, I'm Derek London. Thanks for checking out my channel. Around here we talk about everything law of attraction. We discuss a lot about the psychological, scientific, and rational basis for subscribing to this philosophy of mind. And in fact, if your reality could stand some change for the better, you have only to start there, with your mind. Hit that subscribe button and settle in, because your life will never be the same. Hey everyone, great to have you. Thanks as always for stopping by. So as mentioned, lately I've been talking about the witnesses, mainly addressing those who are open-minded about the other side of the argument. There are a number of members at all levels of this society who turn to the internet to educate themselves. It's not just those who are spiritually weak or already drifted away from the religion. Now I just wish to emphasize, reiterate, underscore, and italicize that when I encourage ones to stay and effect change from within, I'm speaking to active witnesses. I'm speaking to ones who simply do not have the luxury of leaving without losing their families and livelihood. I'm speaking to ones who are sympathetic to its doctrines. I'm focused on those who don't see life outside of the religion. How hypocritical would it be of me as an ex-witness to tell everyone just to go back to the meetings? Clearly that's not what I'm saying. If it was, then why would I even be speaking on YouTube? The reception of my recent videos have been overwhelmingly positive. Most people certainly get what I'm driving at here. However, there were a few questions raised in the comments that I feel obliged to answer. I already rejoined the first one. If you're an ex-witness or a non-witness, I'm not telling you to become a member or return to your former faith. That wasn't what I was saying. The other rebuke I received generally took the form of, "Et tu, London?" In other words, here we are as anti-Jehovah's Witness activists speaking out against the horrible policies that are damaging lives, trying to wake people up. And now you, London, now there's a voice on the internet telling witnesses they shouldn't leave, but in fact stay? And my response to that is, well, in many cases, such as the ones I just laid out, that's exactly what people should do. Yes, some folks should stay and fight for their faith. True progress is an inside job. That applies equally to individuals as it does to organizations. It's an essential component to what I teach regarding the law of attraction. If you relegate your happiness and ultimate sense of meaning to external realities, it will evade you. There are more productive and healthy modes of existing than turning Martin Luther and railing against the world. I'd first actually like to direct a number of comments to anti-witness activists out there. So I'm not speaking so much to ex-witnesses right now. I'm talking to the ones who are bent on this group's dissolution or elimination. Let's acknowledge all the corruption of the Jehovah's Witnesses for a moment. Let's acknowledge the improper reportage of legal evidence to authorities. Let's recognize the excommunication issue, the historical affiliation with the Freemasons, their questionable investments in Boeing, Philip Morris, Monsanto, various oil companies, their failed eschatological predictions. Let's register all of that. These are all fantastic reasons to reject the governing body's authority in our lives. Okay, here's my question. Why does it follow, most times is just a given, that this organization should cease to exist? And even if that does follow, even if one could draw up a proper balance sheet and do all the accounting, the millions of computations involved in proving how the universe would be a better place had they not existed, here's my next question. What makes you believe you're really going to dismantle a very well-moneyed, decently managed, international establishment such as the Jehovah's Witnesses? You see, I'm more than happy to concede that progressive change is a tricky business, that those who are more or less stuck do indeed have their work cut out for them. But be honest, of the two programs put forward here, which is more likely to succeed? I've said it before and I'll say it again. There remain 1 billion Catholics following the better part of 2 millennia of institutional corruption. The witnesses are likely here to stay. Perhaps we ex-witnesses should practice what we preach to our believing friends and family by abandoning the wishful revolutionary delusions of conversion or dissuasion, instead seeking a more tolerant and creative solution. I was also intrigued to see a reference to the fall of the Soviet Union under Gorbachev in my comments as well. This is a pretty interesting comment. Who remember those famous words, "He who comes too late is punished by life"? In context, the commenter's quote was suggesting that, much like the Soviet Union, the Watchtower Society is beyond repair. It's a dead parrot. And I'd concede that I don't have a crystal ball to peer at. Let's assume the Jehovah's Witnesses do collapse under the weight of their own contradictions. The truth is, it is precisely Mikhail Gorbachev's message of glasnost and perestroika that I'm advancing for those on the inside. Don't let's forget, despite not succeeding in his larger goal of reforming the communist apparatchik from within, he still managed to surgically and narrowly avoid a lethal civil war, put an end to the Cold War, and restore relations with the international community, such as had never been seen before, nor has existed since. I'm under no delusions about how rigid things are among the witnesses. Trust me, I was a zealous member for over 2 decades. But I believe that, if anything, Gorbachev is a dramatic illustration of the kind of relationships that can be enjoyed when cooler heads prevail. Before I address specifically how progressive change happens, I'd like to point out some peculiar inconsistencies among anti-witness activists. On the one hand, they're overjoyed to expose all the flip-flopping the governing body has committed over the years. And trust me, there's been a lot of them. But then claim that change is in fact not possible. They brilliantly protest the society's misuse and overuse of that scripture, Proverbs 4:18, regarding the light of spiritual elucidation getting brighter. You know the one I'm talking about, right? It's that get out of jail free scripture the governing body likes to trot out whenever they oh so humbly abridge their policy or understanding on anything. But these anti-witness activists inconsistently aver that progress is impossible. Here's my favorite contradiction among anti-witness activists. They claim that this religion is nothing but a profit-driven, self-serving, free labor exploitative enterprise. And that's largely a sustainable accusation as well. The Watchtower Bible and Tract Society is an obscenely wealthy entity which operates on the same paradigm that most Western institutions do. And that paradigm goes something like, they'll get in line when it affects their bottom line. So the anti-witnesses say they're nothing but a money racket which obeys the open market and will do whatever it takes to protect their financial interests. They also delight in showing how the organization has slowly stagnated in their growth, barely expanding at above the average birth rate and net loss of publishers. But then they conclude by saying that the governing body won't give up 1 inch of control over their members. As I've demonstrated, this is a complete contradiction in logic. You can't accuse this organization of flip-flopping, but then say they never change. You can't say they're motivated by market interests alone, then insist that policy changes will not be forthcoming as they stagnate in growth and lose out on voluntary donations. Let me be clear, there's a platform for this activism. I fully support people having their say. I totally understand the reasonable hostility. I don't believe any person or religion should be above criticism. But anti-witness activists seem to me almost as drunk with promissory vituperations of doom as their believing counterparts. Perhaps these politicking opponents don't take to my message precisely because it is tedious and will involve a generous amount of bipartisanship, goodwill, and patience, which only proves my point that dogmatism exists on either side of that religion. I think it's obvious there are far more positive and fruitful ways of dealing with this. So is progress really possible, even within a highly weaponized control group like the Witnesses? Well, I believe it is, to a certain extent. Again, I'm addressing those without the luxury of leaving. And it's important to understand that there are 2 different forms of progress I'll be speaking on here. These are what's called de facto and de jure reforms. De facto reform is a little more subtle. This is what happens when attitudes and mindsets change. It's generally cultural, and it's only really obvious in hindsight. De facto changes are imperceptible from day to day. De jure reform, by contrast, is what happens when there are shifts in policy, procedure, understanding, or evolutions of that sort. Not only are these things possible, they're taking place under your nose as we speak. Nothing is static in any society or institution. The Jehovah's Witnesses are a microcosm of the broader environment or world. Let's talk about how things have changed outside this group, and I'll narrow my focus to progressions that have happened within the group itself. Here's the world we find ourselves in today. The outside world has become far more liberal and tolerant toward minorities. This includes racial and ethnic minorities, but also socially marginalized groups such as those belonging to the LGBTQ+ community. Sexual ethics and views towards traditional marriage and family values are changing. More and more women are entering the workforce, gaining status and influence. People are far less religious than they used to be. Technology has brought the outside world into our most private areas of the home. The world imposes itself upon us through our tablets and phones while we eat, groom ourselves, relieve ourselves, and through periods of insomnia during the twilight hours. It is no longer possible to escape the constant inundation of press. Not even Bethelites can fully escape if they wanted to. Scientific research and speculations are continually forcing us to update our metaphysical philosophies towards the cosmos. I was speaking to a witness some time ago who actually subscribes to to multi- and parallel universe theory, a branch of physics which is about as ad hoc as any other theology. Interesting nevertheless. How he squares that with his scriptural perspective must demand acute mental exertion. But that's what he believes. The world is getting wealthier. Universal literacy is almost a reality. People are more educated. Just about 60% of the globe has access to internet now. Globalization, tourism, migration, ease of travel and access is improving. Decriminalization and legalization of marijuana use is sweeping legislatures throughout the Western world. Governments are becoming less tolerant towards religious fundamentalism and biblical literalism. Since 2002, the lid on clerical privilege and secrecy has completely exploded with a litany of institutional sex abuse cover-ups dominating the news media, federal investigation, and litigation in one saga after the next. That's just a tiny snapshot of the world in its present form. I'm not agreeing with all these shifts. I'm simply saying it's becoming increasingly difficult to consistently hold positions we once did publicly. Now, policy or de jure revisions are admittedly difficult among this group and will likely never be as forthcoming as we'd like. You have to realize that we're dealing with a fairly conservative branch of Christianity here. You can't expect the liberalism that exists in the Anglican Church of Canada or various interfaith groups, for instance. And in fairness, there is a radical side to progressivism that is deeply problematic and worth resisting. If you're expecting Christianity to become like that, well, some would argue that it will cease to be Christianity. And that's a justified opinion. Conservative or traditional philosophy has a lot going for it. Having said all that, many reforms have taken place at the institutional level for the witnesses. The doctrines have become soppy, vague, and metaphorical with the governing body's hysterical overlapping generation update, just as an example. That one was a beauty, by the way. They've softened their position on microevolution and six-day creationism. Nowadays, they generally shy away from making hard and fast predictions like they used to. They're still tremendously alarmist, but have not repeated the gaffes of 1925 and 75. It's true that their judicial dealings are illegitimate to begin with, but for what it's worth, these proceedings have become much more sophisticated and bureaucratic than they were. Depending on the notoriety of certain wrongs that were committed, if someone wants to remain a witness, then there is an entire apparatus of shepherding that is available to prevent the excommunication of individuals. Again, it's a total sham to begin with. I've said before, I think their judicial proceedings are a joke, and the disfellowshipping arrangement is bloody diabolical. But it's not as punitive as it once was. The policies surrounding reportage of legal evidence is horribly backwards in Bronze Age too. But they have made a few minor adjustments in how such situations are handled. That issue, by the way, is fairly complicated. It's far more involved than just reporting every accusation of abuse. Their policies need to be completely rewritten. I'm not defending how they handle this issue, but my simple point is that it's not as easy as just turning over all accusations of abuse to the authorities. They can be held liable for mishandling such incredibly private details. On YouTube, this whole controversy has been reduced to a 3-word cliche called the two-witness rule, when the reality is infinitely more complex than that. I followed that official inquiry conducted by the Australian Royal Commission very closely and read the ensuing report in its entirety. It can't be reduced to a slogan, and you should be suspect when highly motivated political actors try to do that. Moving on. Their handling of cases involving addiction, drugs, alcohol, infidelity, and other common quote-unquote sins are not as severe as they once were. They're still considered judicial matters, but as I say, they're way more focused on shepherding now. I think it's worth stating too that I've noticed a huge softening towards alcoholism. Let me know in the comments if you've noticed this as well. Many of the elders I knew were pretty hard drinkers. I've also noticed that the way the society writes on homosexuality is not quite as condemnatory as it once was. Yes, it's still a judicial matter, but there's a bit more understanding for the fact that these feelings and attractions among certain individuals are involuntary. So says the February 2007 Awake entitled Homosexuality. How can I avoid it? They've become a little more accommodating in their position on blood even, keeping abreast of advances in technology and treatments. They've relaxed their standards for those reaching out in the congregation as pioneers, ministerial servants, and elders. They've amended their position on members taking each other to court for specific issues surrounding wills or child custody and other things. I mean, that was a pretty stupid policy to begin with, in my opinion, but it's at least relaxed a little bit. So I've barely scratched the surface, but yes, policies have changed and are constantly evolving. De jure transformations do happen. That's to say little of the overall zeitgeist within the society. Attitudes, that is, de facto reality, has moved as well. I'm noticing the hairstyles and facial hair trends among millennials are rubbing off on the group. According to good old Tight Pants Tony, he's observed the dress code has relaxed, or tightened depending on how you look at it. I've noticed on Facebook how some members are wishing co-workers and relatives happy birthday without actually saying those words verbatim. I'm noticing there's a little more carte blanche given to members in their dealings with excommunicated ones and unbelievers, especially surrounding weddings, funerals, and business transactions. Yes, you'll likely get B-schooled if they notice you associating with them regularly, but attitudes have softened toward this. Anyway, my point is that progress does happen. If you have no choice but to stay a member, it is possible to be a positive force for good from within. At minimum, you can at least not participate in the most harmful of practices they engage in. And where you can move the needle a little bit, you should try, always using extreme finesse and discretion, of course. If your loyalties are with them and you're reaching out, trust me, they'll be a little more accepting of your worldview. One of the main questions they ask you in a judicial committee is, do you want to continue being a Jehovah's Witness? Should you respond in the positive, it's unusual and generally against policy to arbitrarily disfellowship someone. That's if you're in this worst case scenario. I'm not defending them. I'm simply saying that if you really want to maintain membership and don't want to lose everything, there is some wiggle room there. Not all of the elders are so-called company men. I know several elders who believe it's the truth, but will recuse themselves from a judicial proceeding long before they ever disfellowship anyone. They're uncommon, but they do exist. If you're a witness, I understand religious affiliation is more profound than just a few simple arguments or beliefs. There's room in this world for coexistence. I actually think it's more respectable for someone to work positively within the environment they find themselves than to be an outsider screaming at the wind. If you want to learn how you can better affect change within the society, you should watch a video I produced a little while ago called Jehovah's Witnesses Fighting for Survival. It'll be linked below in the description and in the end screen. Let me know what you think of that in the comments. Hope it helped. My name is Derek London. I'll see you again very soon. Hey guys, did you like this video? You know what to do. And if something I mentioned today resonated with you, click one of them cards on this screen. I have lots of related content sure to interest you. Thanks as always for your views, and we'll see you next time.